It's episode 61 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Thank you for joining me each week as I interview authors and we talk about writing and the creative process. If you enjoy the show, I really would appreciate it if you would go to hankgarner.com, listen through all of the archives, go to iTunes and rate the show, leave a comment if you'd like, but at least go over and rate it so that other people can find the show and enjoy what you're enjoying. Also, if you would click on the Amazon banner in the right-hand sidebar and then go to Amazon and shop like you normally would, you can help support the show. Each time you buy something, the show gets a small commission from that, and that helps us to keep doing what we do each week. This week my guest is Jim Butcher, author of The Dresden Files, Codex Alera, and his new series, The Cinder Spires. Thank you for joining me. I really do appreciate you tuning in each week and help spread the news of the show. Tell everyone to go to hankgarner.com and check out the archives. Now on to the show. Welcome to the show, Jim Butcher.
Thank you very much.
Glad to have you on. We always start the show with a variation on the same question, and it is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer?
Oh, golly. Probably the first time I considered it seriously was when Margaret Weiss came into my high school and started giving a talk about what being a writer was like. And I happened to be skipping class that day and was in the library reading and when she came in. So I kind of got the benefit of A, not getting caught skipping class, and B, actually getting to hear a professional writer talk about the business.
Were you familiar with her work at the time?
Oh yeah, I've been a huge fan of Dragonlance, so I wanted to hear what she had to say.
Oh, nice. What kind of impact did that have on you?
Well, it made me think that it was possible. It was within about a year and a half that I started writing my first novel, which was awful because it was my first novel.
Right. As is everyone's.
Yeah, basically, yeah. But that was the first thing. That was when I first, thought, oh, hey, maybe this might be possible for me to actually do. I mean, somebody else from Independence, my hometown did it. So if somebody else can do it, why can't I do it?
Nice. So how old were you around this time?
I wrote the first one when I was 20, I think.
Okay. So you were probably a senior in high school or so when this happened?
Oh, yeah, it was my senior year, yeah.
Gotcha. And what... You said shortly after that you wrote your first novel. What was the premise of that first novel?
It was a swords and horses fantasy novel, and there was a quest, and there was a villain, somebody who had to be destroyed, and there was a magic knife. So I mean, it was fairly stereotypical fantasy fare, and not very good stereotypical fantasy fare.
That seems to be those typical tropes. Seem to be in a lot of people's first novel. What do you think it is about those kind? I mean, and they're tropes, but they're kind of time tested when done right, because they keep coming back up. What do you think it is about that?
Well, I like to say that the difference between writing an archetypal story and writing a cliche story is presentation.
True.
When you tell the story right, then you're working with archetypes, and you've got Star Wars. And when you don't do a good job, then you've got a cliche, one of the many horrible cliche clones of Star Wars.
Right. And then there are many series, many MANY series that begin good and wind up in cliche, which is a whole other thing. But so that first novel that you wrote didn't really cut the mustard, so to speak, but you kept at it.
Oh yes,
and
yes, I wrote a second novel, and it was also horrible.
What gave you the motivation to keep trying?
Well, I'm sort of an irrationally stubborn human being, and just sort of there's a broad contrary streak to my nature. So anybody who says I can't do something, I automatically want to do it. Do not enter signs drive me crazy. Uh, uh, but generally speaking, I mean, I knew that if I kept trying and kept working at it and kept improving my skills, that I would get better at it, and I really wanted to do that. It was one of the only jobs that I'd looked at that I thought I could do for a living without driving myself crazy.
And obviously it worked. Did you get encouragement from someone early on in your writing, or was this something that you kept to yourself? Did you have a mentor at all?
When I got started, no. I was just doing it on my own, and I was just trying to get anybody I could to read my novels. My sisters were very encouraging to me. Families is very important in something like that. Eventually, I found the professional writing department at the University of Oklahoma, and I happened on a teacher there, Deborah Chester, who was a very, very good teacher and had a whole lot of really smart things to teach me. So she tried to teach me, and I resisted her completely, being who I am. But eventually she got through to me, and eventually I started listening to what she had to say. She had all these extremely intelligent things to say about writing craft and story craft, and that was what I had been missing. I mean, I had my degree in English literature. I knew a lot about literature as it when it came to looking at it. But when it came to creating stories, that's a completely different ball of wax. And I had to reach that point where I had to stop and realize, oh, wait a minute, I don't know anything about actually telling stories. Analyzing stories is not telling stories, and telling stories is an entirely different ballgame.
Yeah. Is there any one thing that really jumps out at you that makes the difference in being a critic and being a writer?
No, the major difference is that the writer is busy creating something. I mean, you've got to create it from whole cloth. The critic has the advantage of being able to look at something somebody else has made and then to start analyzing what's there. When you're the writer, you don't have anything there except what's in your head. And then the challenge, like with any art, is to take what's in your head and trying to find a way to give that a body, to present that as something that other people can see and understand, and take that image in your mind and give it to someone else. That's what art and communication is all about.
So the first book that you wrote that got published and gained attention was Stormfront, the first book in the Dresden files.
Yes.
How did that first book come about?
Well, I was in the writing a genre fiction novel course with Debbie Chester, and the course material was very simple. You wrote a genre fiction novel over the course of a semester. And I'd written several novels in this course because you could take it multiple times, and they were terrible. I mean, they were bad. Um, and Debbie continued trying to push me into learning, her methods, which I thought were just robotic and rigid and stupid. And so one semester I decided that I was going to prove to her how wrong she was about everything she was trying to teach me. Now, bear in mind here, I was a student in my mid-20s with a bachelor's degree in English literature,
Right.
with an emphasis on creative writing. So I knew what I was talking about.
Of course.
Who was Debbie? She had merely published 40 novels. So I decided that the means that the tautology that I was going to use to get this across was brilliant to my way of thinking. I was going to do exactly what she told me to do. I was going to follow all of her suggestions and guidelines. I was going to do her outlines and her character profiles and do her story structure and her chapter outlines exactly like she told me to. And I was going to be her good little writing zombie. And then she would see what terrible, awful, horrible cookie cutter pablum crap emerged from that kind of process. And so I wrote the first book, The Dresden Files.
So you said that she had a very specific story craft process, and you didn't want to hear that. So I assumed that you were very much a loose pantser at that time, and believed that was the only way to do it.
Oh, I was all about writing for the subtext and writing, for to carry the message and so on. At the time. I was, I thought I knew a lot. Um, but yeah, as it turns out, telling a story is, telling a story well, telling a story in such a way that it grabs people's attention and gets their emotions invested in it and keeps them turning the pages and interested in what's going to happen. That is a process that is so involved that you don't really have a whole lot of time left over for this extraneous stuff, like worrying about your subtext. I mean, all that stuff goes into the story, but it sort of goes in there while you're busy working.
Right.
And it's not something that I really think you can put a lot of conscious process into without completely boring the audience. So my focus these days is just it's my job to tell a good story, and that's what I'm focused on is making sure that I'm presenting the kind of drama and the kind of character interaction that I think people are going to enjoy reading. My job is to keep people turning the pages, and so when they buy one of my books, they're up until 4 a.m. on a work night finishing.
Right.
That's my job. That's my goal. Other stuff, let the English critics, read that into it. I don't really care about that anymore.
Well, and you've ruined a lot of work days for me, and I just want to
Excellent. I'm
thank you
glad
for
to hear that.
that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and
That's like heroin for writers to hear that.
I know, I know. Well, I, we'll come back to that whole outlining thing in just a moment, but you brought up a really great point about writing for subtext and the deeper meaning and that sort of thing. The Dresden Files specifically have deal with a lot of deep subjects, and there's a lot of spiritual overtones, lots of I mean there is a lot of subtext in there. Uh, is that something that you consciously have in the back of your mind, or do you set out to try to um, tackle a certain topic, or is it just story and these things just emerge?
Oh yeah, no, God, no. I don't set out to do any of that. I just tell the story. When I'm writing, regardless of what I'm writing, my primary goal in writing it is to provide a story world where things are interesting and fun and that will keep the reader's attention and keep them reading. There are a lot of people. I mean, I have been read by a lot of people, and they've drawn some stuff from my material that was not stuff that I ever intended to put in there. But I've kind of looked at their reasoning and gone, huh, yeah, I guess you could read it that way. I've one of my especially when it comes to religion and faith and belief. One of my proudest achievements that I have personally as an author is on the same day I got an email from a Wiccan high priest thanking me for treating his religion with respect, and I also got on the same day I got a letter from a Catholic cardinal thanking me for treating his religion with respect, and telling me how he found my work interesting and how he really liked the way that I was having presenting people of faith and having them confront these problems. And the same from the Wiccan high priest. So I figured I think I must be doing either something very right or something very wrong, one of the two. I don't know which it is, but two very happy readers, from two very different ends of the spectrum.
Well, and you do handle these topics of faith and belief and and I can see where that would be very tricky ground to try to navigate because you do deal with not only angels and demons, but some of these other very religious topics. We'll just leave it at that. So uh, that's one thing I've always admired about the Dresden Files is that Harry has his own struggles and his own things, but you handle that in a very believable way. So I appreciate that as well. But where did Harry come from? So you set out to write this genre novel formulaic to prove to her that it wouldn't work. Uh,
Hmm.
so Why Harry Dresden? Why a wizard PI?
Well, I was wanting to do the whole wizard PI thing was just that was what I wanted to do. I took Private Investigator, and that was the book I wanted to write because she'd been urging me to write a mystery, and I was like, fine, but I'm going to have a wizard as my PI.
And that opening chapter of Stormfront is still one of the very best of establishing that premise that you open it up and you just laugh out loud but then it just sucks you in. So it's amazing.
Oh, when putting Harry together was really just a matter of he was really a Frankenstein of a character outline because I went and I took my top three favorite wizards and my top three favorite private eyes and chopped up the bits and took the parts that I liked and kind of stuck them onto this creation that was going to be Harry Dresden. And it's just sort of so I'm grabbing Sherlock's and some of Sherlock and some of Gandalf and some of Spencer and a bit of sorry, excuse me, I'm having one of those brain moments.
That's okay.
But some of Spencer and some of Merlin and just kind of and taking the bits that I wanted and stitching them all together into this Frankenstein of a whole character, and then running 10,000 volts through him and screaming "It's alive" and throwing him into chapter 1. But it was somebody he was this character who it felt very, very artificial and very terrible to me and far too exaggerated and far too cartoonish at the time I was writing him. But that was really the main thing that was holding me back was I was unwilling to kind of go out on a limb and step outside my comfort zone of where I'd been as imagining myself as this fantasy literary writer. And as a result, my characters were coming off, sort of flat and stale and not very interesting and muted. And when what I needed was to get a little bit more Scooby-Doo with things, a little bit more color, a little bit more cartoonishness was kind of what my style needed in order to create characters that would actually grab people's attention.
Was it difficult for you switching gears from that epic fantasy to this kind of modern urban fantasy? Was that a stretch for you?
Oh God, yes. It was a disaster. I mean, it was a disaster that succeeded. But I mean, it wasn't what I set out to write, or what I had prepared myself to write, or what I had been focused on as my goal for writing. I still haven't gotten to write the kind of the Tolkien-esque epic fantasy that I wanted to do. Because I keep doing all these other things. I mean, eventually, one day, when I'm a grown-up writer, I'll write my epic fantasy, epic Tolkien-esque thing, someday. But yeah, I mean, it was here I was. I had been studying and learning all these things that just didn't apply, and I had to go learn all these new things.
I interviewed Dan Wells on the show several months ago, and he was talking about when he and Brandon Sanderson were, I think they were roommates, or they were at least in college together, and that Dan kept trying to write this epic fantasy, and everyone kept telling him, well, you need to write horror, because when you're just doodling, that's what comes out. And then I think he's up to like book 6 in his John Cleaver series now or something.
Right.
When you finally just surrender and go with what's naturally coming out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So when did you know that you were onto something with Harry Dresden?
Well, I mean, the books got sold, and that was cool. But for the first couple of years, I would go to conventions, and they would say, Jim Butcher reading from his new Dresden Files book, and nobody would show up. Or I'd go to signings, and nobody would buy a book or come by my table to get anything signed. It was... that's kind of some of the hazing that you go through as an author when people haven't heard of you yet.
Right.
But the only way to get done with it is to go through it. And I think the first time I realized that things were changing was when I went to I got invited to Dragon Con one year, and they said they wanted to have a panel that was just me on a panel, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess if you've got a room that you don't want to have anybody in, I'll help you do that. And but I mean, I figured it was just going to be, that nobody would really care, nobody would show up, and but that I wanted to be professional and be there on time, because typically that was the way it had gone. And so, I'm going down this escalator to go to the room, and I'm running a little bit late because it's way more crowded than any other convention I've ever been to, and it takes way longer to get anywhere than any convention I've been to. And I get down there, and the hallway back to the room I'm going to be in is just packed with people, and I'm like, oh, great. Now I'm going to be late because there's some big shot in the hallway here.
Right.
That's also got a panel going, and I'm never going to get there on time. And I'm sitting there looking at my clock and fretting, and then I realize that the hall has gone quiet and everybody is staring at me, and I'm like, what? And are you Jim Butcher? And I'm like, do I owe you money? And they're like, no, we're here for your panel. We're all here for your panel. And I'm like, what? What are you all right? Did you not have anything better to do? I didn't really understand what was going on. And then I had a panel room that was packed full of people in standing room only, and some people hanging out in the door, outside. And that was the first time that there'd been like a bunch of people. I remember just being flabbergasted by that, because it was what I had been aiming for and hoping for, and that's kind of what you dream for as a writer. But here it was happening, and I was very dismayed, because what are all these people doing at my panel? I'm used to it being just me.
And which book was out at that time?
I believe that was right about the time that Death Mask came out. It was right when book 5 was being released.
Okay. So you were trudging along up to 5 releases before you were getting the kind of feedback that made you confident that this was going somewhere.
Well, that was the first time it hit me in the face, yeah.
Right.
And I'm kind of dense, so it had to hit me in the face in order for me to notice it.
Well, I think a lot of people assume that if there's not, we live in this instant gratification culture where if things aren't going swimmingly the first 3 months that a book is released, then we're just going to give up and go try basket weaving or something. Obviously, this writing thing is not.
Yeah.
And there's something to be said for longevity and for sticking to it, whether the rewards are coming yet or not.
Yeah. I mean, it was from the time I wrote my first novel to the time I sold anything at all. It was 9 years, and that was 9 years of working a part-time job without anybody paying me for it. And that's a considerable amount of effort to go to, and to have basically nobody helping you along. I mean, my ex was very supportive of me, and I remain grateful for that. And my kid thought I would do it eventually. He always believed in his dad, and my sisters would cheer me on. But that didn't help a lot when it's you've just gotten off your shift, and all you really want to do is go to sleep, but you haven't got anything done today. So you really need to continue pretending to be a writer. So you've got to sit down for an hour at that keyboard when you're exhausted and get a few pages written. Those are some very lonely moments, man. It's hard to do that as a writer. I mean, it's hard to put that time in, to invest that time for something that may or may not ever pay off for you in the future.
Right. Absolutely. And what advice would you give people that are in those doldrums, in the lonely hours of being a writer, and it's not paying off, and you're not paying the mortgage with your writing yet? What advice would you give people that are there?
2 things. First of all, when you're trying to break in, especially when you're trying to break in, you don't have to worry about competing with like me or Brandon Sanderson or Pat Rothfuss. When you're trying to break in, they always have a couple of slots. Every publisher has a couple of slots reserved every year for new writers. They do that because if they don't do that, eventually all their old writers will die.
Right.
So they're always trying to come up with the best new writers they can find. So there's always slots reserved for newbies. That means that you're not competing with all of us. You're only competing with the other newbies. It's sort of like when you're running away from the bear. You don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than the guy next to you.
Right.
And in this case, you just have to be faster than the other newbies. Now, the longer you've been practicing, the longer you've been honing your skills and learning things and continuing to write the next story and to improve what you can do, the more likely you are to be able to beat out all these other newbies who are in the same place you are. And in fact, if you stick it out long enough, eventually you will be more skilled than all the other new people, and you'll have the chance to sell your book. I mean, it took me 9 years, and that was the kind of the long grindy way to do it. But I eventually did it that way.
Yeah.
So that's part one. If you stick at it long enough, you will eventually have more skills than all the other new people who are just now trying it out, and that'll get you sold. And second, the only one who can stop you from getting published is you. You're the only one who can decide to quit. Nobody else can say no. You will never get sold, because if you continue writing, continue honing your skill, you will get good enough that people will want to hear what you have to say, and they'll want to read what you have to write. So the only one who can stop you is you, by deciding to stop. Otherwise, just keep going. I mean, it's hard at times, but that's the price of getting in. Is you have to keep going. You have to motivate yourself and be the one who pushes yourself through the badlands until you get to where you want to go.
And I think that grindy way, as you put it, of powering through is probably the norm. I think there are probably more successful authors that had a long period of grinding it out, showing up every day, writing, or every other day or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
And putting in the words and the hours. And very rarely are overnight successes truly overnight successes.
Yeah, they aren't. And let me tell you, standing where I am now and looking back at it, if it had taken me twice as long to break in, it still would have been worth it. I mean, I really regard. I don't ever think about those 9 years where I couldn't get anything done and how hard it was. I don't think about that anymore. I'm too busy thinking about how I've got to get the next Harry Dresden book done by Christmas, and it's like, oh wait, I've got interviews tonight. Oh, okay, I'm gonna have to shuffle some things around for these interviews. I don't have to think about the tough times anymore. Those kind of go away. Those become something that you look back at and go, yeah, I was kind of badass to do that. All right, time to continue doing cool stuff.
Well, they say that a woman doesn't remember all of the pain of labor. And my wife and I have 5 kids, so and I think she would probably argue that. But there's something about being on the other side of that and having the joy of a child that kind of obscures the all the pain and the heartache that went into getting it there. And I think writing success, but any success probably has that effect on us as well. So you have you came up with this idea for Harry Dresden when your mentor challenged you, and how long did it take when you wrote the book and you showed it to her? What was her response to what you had written? Your challenge to prove her wrong.
She read the first 2 chapters, put them down, looked at me across her desk, and said, "You did it." I said, "What?" She said, "You did it. I don't know if this will be the first thing you sell, but this is of professional quality, and you will sell it if you continue writing it."
Wow.
Yeah, and that was, I had never gotten feedback like that from her before, ever. I mean, her feedback had included such things as rolling up the chapter, leaning across the desk, and rapping me lightly on the head with it and saying, "What were you thinking?"
Oh my gosh.
I mean, she did not believe in going easy on her students. She believed that publishing was a tough world, and that you had to deal with them with brutal honesty in order to prepare them for it. And by the time she looked up and said, "You did it," it just floored me.
So did that immediately change your opinion of Harry Dresden and of her process?
Oh my God, yes, of course it did. She says, now you need to go home and plan the rest of it, and she was referring to the rest of the novel. But I came back to her the next week with a plan for a 20-book series and a big old apocalyptic 3-book trilogy to capstone it off. And I babbled about the entire plan to her and was like, "What do you think?" And she'd worked so hard to get me thinking the right direction. She didn't want to kill my enthusiasm, So I just remember this deadpan look on her face as she kept herself from laughing, because I was never going to sell a 20-book series to a publisher anywhere. And then she just sort of nodded and said, "Yeah, I think if you can get a 20-book series going, that should be fine."
And so far, 15 books have been published in the Dresden Files.
Yeah, 15 books and one anthology of short stories, and I'm working on book 16, and we'll be doing a second anthology here in the next couple of years. And yeah, it's been quite an adventure.
Are you still thinking 20 books?
It might be 21 to get everything I want to get in. To set up the big trilogy at the end. But yeah, 2021, we're pretty close.
Man, does that 20 or 21 include the trilogy, or is the trilogy
No, the trilogy comes after.
Will that still be a Dresden Files? The trilogy is part of the Dresden Files.
Yeah, exactly.
Story arc.
Yeah,
okay.
but it'll be the big finale, So.
Gotcha. So, are you still kind of working in the framework of that master plan that you dreamed up all those years ago?
Oh God, yes. I'm getting superstitious about it now. I mean, it's really, really not broken. Why should I fix it?
Yeah. How do you keep? Well, a couple of things. How do you keep that big a secret for that long when you're working toward an end goal that you have in mind? How do you protect that?
You don't tell anybody about it. I mean, that's pretty simple. That part isn't hard.
Gotcha. And the other thing is, how do you keep that on track for that long? Now, do you meticulously outline each of these books before you write them? What's your outlining process like?
I'm a real strong outliner on a chapter-to-chapter level.
Okay.
I have to have the whole chapter kind of formalized and to understand how it goes in my head before I can really sit down to write the chapter. As far as the overstory goes, I just kind of know the general direction of the arc of the story's history and kind of the big events that are going to be happening. But there's lots of different potential paths that we could take to get there. So a lot of times I'm relying on my characters making decisions in the moment as I'm writing them to determine which fork in the road we're going to be taking to get to to get to the destination. For example, in Changes, Harry basically has to make a choice. He's got to make a deal with the devil, but he's got 2 or 3 different devils that he can pick from. And I wasn't sure which way he was going to go until I was actually, there at the keyboard writing the scene. So the story would have had very different turns if he had decided to go with taking up Lashiel's coin instead of making a deal with Mab, or if he decided to take up the necromantic power of the word from the word of Kemmler, and kind of drawn on this kind of really dark evil energy to get done what he needed to get done. The story would have had a very different shape depending on which choice he had made there. But he made the one that I thought made the most sense for the character, for where he was right there, and so off we went. But the important point of the overall plan was that Harry was going to get backed up against a wall and have to choose somebody to go to ally himself with. And so the nature of that choice, sort of changed. Not the overall direction of the story world, because the overall direction would have been the same. He was going to go get his little girl back, regardless of the consequences. But the specifics of how those stories would have played out were going to be very different based on those choices. And a lot of times in the story, there's these characters are making these choices, and there's a lot of different ways they can go. I've got this cloud of alternate realities of the Dresden Files in my head that make it impossible for me to keep track accurately of what actually did get written. I have to go consult the fan Wikipedia in order to work out, what did I wind up writing? Oh yeah, that. Okay, good. Good. That's a much easier choice to work with than 2 or 3 of these other ways that it could have panned out.
I love it. I think for a lot of writers, this whole outlining thing just seems like voodoo to them. that and as someone who you know you kind of shun the whole writing by formula thing, but then were sold on how that it actually worked for you. What would you tell people who would well, and and it doesn't help that Stephen King, in On Writing, probably a book that most writers have read at least once, is very anti-outlining,
Yeah, he is.
and so you get a lot of people that are new to it, and they say, well, I'll start with this book because no one's as successful as Stephen King, and then he tells me that I should do it this way. But he is a rare exception of someone that is prolific and is a pantser. What would
Well,
you
yeah,
say to people who are scared of that?
well, he's completely a pantser, but he also turns out really, in many ways, unreliable books. I mean,
Right.
some of his books come to these huge, fantastic conclusions, and then some of them are more like Tommy knockers.
And they just kind of fizzle at the end.
Yeah, where you're just kind of like, wait, what? Or like The Stand was this enormous epic, but there's a there's a broad swath of criticism for the ending of The Stand, which literally the literal hand of God shows up, and
Right.
I mean, and one of the ways that you avoid that kind of inconsistency is to kind of have an idea of what the structure is going to be. I always, whenever and as a writer, you're always, there are always people you're trying to teach, because it's at some point the only way you can continue learning is to start teaching the craft to other people.
Right.
And what I always tell people is you need to be able to write something within an outline. You need to know how it works. This goes along with you don't have to do it that way your entire career, but you really need to learn what it does look like when you do it like that. It goes along with like the old Zen saying of you need to learn all the rules so that you can know how to break them properly.
I like that. How much research goes into a Dresden Files book? You say that you get comments from a Wiccan and a Catholic priest in the same day, both complimenting you on your fair treatment of their religion. You obviously, to be able to handle these topics with such care and with such dignity, then you have to know what you're talking about. So how much research goes into these books as the story unfolds?
When I think of research for a specific book, I always think of it as some specific topic that I didn't know about that I need to learn about for the book. So if I'm writing this book and one of the major props in the book is going to be Sue the dinosaur at the Natural History Museum in Chicago, then I've got time to spend learning about Sue. Although that's kind of misleading, because what really happened was that I learned all about Sue and then realized, oh my gosh, I'm going to be able to use this in a book 5 years from now. That's going to be awesome. And that's really kind of how most of my research takes place. I like reading, and I like going out and learning stuff. And while I'm out reading and learning new stuff, I find things that would be awesome in a book, and my research has been done without it being tedious research, because I was just out there learning it and reading it anyway.
Right.
But there are always details that I have to stop and learn about. It's like, okay, I got to learn about how this explosive works, because they're going to be using this later in the book, or I need to know about this particular kind of firearm, this particular kind of car, or this specific location in Chicago. I've got to go learn about that. I've got to find a good location for events to happen. That's one of the big research things. Which is so much easier now that they've got Google and Google Street View than it was before. But anyway, so I mean, it's partly a process of I love reading, and I am always watching. I mean, if I've got a choice, I'm generally watching some kind of documentary on TV. I'm subscribed to a bunch of documentary channels on YouTube, to go look at those. It's
Right.
like, ooh, let me look at this documentary about the Roman legions. That's awesome. And it's compulsive for me. So a lot of it is when I learn something cool, it's like, oh, I need to come bring that into a book. It's much more like that than it is like I need to go learn about a bunch of things now that I can write them into the book.
Right. I think one of good writers' strongest tools is that good writers are generally very observant and good listeners. I love to be in groups of people and just listen to the rhythms of conversation and dialogue. And there are lots of things that just come out naturally in writing, just from being observant, just paying attention to the world around you. Um, and you can tell that in the Dresden Files specifically that what I remember what I was going to ask you now. You are a big gamer, aren't you?
Um, Define big game.
Well, you have been you enjoy games and tabletop games.
Well, I have been known to partake, yes.
Yeah. How much did that inform some of RPGs and Dungeons and Dragons and that sort of thing, and the kind of mythical, fantastical? How much of that has informed your writing?
Uh, I don't know as much how much the gaming has informed the writing as much as my writing has informed the gaming.
I like that.
For me, when I GM, because I GM a game, and when I GM a game now, now I always cliffhang the chapters, or I cliffhang the end of the session, so that people are going like, oh, you're going to quit there? It's like, yeah, we'll start up again next week, from this point, and I'll do the little recaps at the start of everything and make sure that I've got enough hooks out there that people remember, oh, this is where we were and here's where we're going, and I torture the player characters with personal stuff to kind of keep them involved in the game, and just generally speaking, treat them like I treat the characters in my books.
Nice.
They seem to like it.
Yeah. I have a group of friends that we're all writers, and I produce a podcast for them called Sci-Fi Writers Playing Old School D&D, and it's just a bunch of writers that get together and we play D&D over Skype, and seeing how that informs your next writing session is always pretty amazing. It's pretty cool. But is it true that Codex Alera came about from a bet?
Oh, yes.
What happened?
Back in 1998, we were on the Del Rey Online Writers Workshop. And what that was it was an online forum for a bunch of unpublished writers to get together and show their work and critique each other's work and have discussions about the craft and the art of writing. So a discussion had happened, and there were two sides arose in a discussion, and each side was championed by a particular loudmouth, and I was one of them, and another guy was another one. I mean, I'm still just an internet loudmouth. I just happen to have some publishing credits now, but the other side. This was pre Dresden Files. Oh yeah, this was 2 years before I was published.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And one guy on the other side was basically championing the idea that the holy idea, capital H, capital I, was what you needed to have a successful book. That if you had a cool enough idea that no matter how badly you wrote it, the book would go over well. And they say, just look at Jurassic Park. That was their example. That was an idea that couldn't miss. Genetically reconstructed dinosaurs, you could not have blown that one. And then I was on the other side of the argument that said you don't need a holy idea if you want to succeed. What you need is to have a good presentation, that a good enough author could put his own spin, his own originality onto any given story, and that if he did it well enough, it would resonate with an audience and it would succeed. And I said, I would say, how many versions of Romeo and Juliet have we seen? And so this discussion went on for a couple of weeks, and it was one of those discussions where you hit, reply and then caps lock and then you start typing. And finally, this guy on the other side says, why don't you put your money where your mouth is? Why don't you let me give you a terrible story idea and see you may write something cool out of it? And me, being young and mouthy and an internet loudmouth, wrote back, no, I tell you what, why don't you give me 2 terrible ideas and I'll use them both? And so the guy says, all right, fine. First terrible idea is Lost Roman Legion. I am so sick of Lost Roman Legion. All the Lost Roman Legion should have been found by now. Lost Roman Legion is first terrible idea. I said, okay, fine. What's the next one? He says, Pokemon. And so I took these two ideas of Lost Roman Legion and Pokemon, and I just started breaking them each down and analyzing them. And the Lost Roman Legion, everybody normally refers to as the Ninth Hibernian Legion, marched off into Scotland and got killed by the Scots, probably. But they're kind of written of in in poetic terms in various places. So suppose these guys marched off into the mist and reappeared somewhere else. Where did they go? Land of the Pokemon. So I went and analyzed the Pokemon, which itself is a fusion of two ideas. The first being the idea of kami in the Shinto religion, that every natural feature has a spirit inside it that you need to respect. So a mountain has a spirit, a river has a spirit, a pool has a spirit. They all have spirits that you need to give, that have power and that you need to give respect to. And then they fused that idea with professional wrestling, and that's where Pokemon came from. But I took these two ideas in this Lost Roman Legion, and I determined what the composition of this legion was. Well, it's about half German mercenaries and about half Roman citizens, and it has this huge cloud of camp followers coming after it, and can plant its own crops and build its own buildings and raise its own herds, and is basically just a great little colonization force. So I said, okay, these guys go to the land of the Pokemon, and they start doing what Romans do. They start conquering and building new Rome. And so they developed this society that was this bifurcated society that was half Roman citizens in these big city centers, and about half of these German freeholds that littered the countryside. And I gave them a couple thousand years to ferment, and they had learned and dealt with these Pokemon, and I had to have a name for them. And Big Trouble in Little China was on in the background when I was trying to come up with a name. And we just got to the part where Egg Chen goes, all movement in the universe is caused by tension between positive and negative Furies. And I went, ooh, Furies. It's even Greco-Roman. And so I named my Pokemon Furies, and figured out that the Romans would figure out how to work with them and use them, and gave them a couple thousand years to build a society out of it with these Furies, and the use of Furies sort of replacing, for the most part, technology. And off they went, and that was, and the news story got started. And I went back to the guy a few weeks later and was like, this is going really well. And because at the time we weren't sure how copyright law was going to intersect with the internet, whether publishing to the internet was going to interfere with first North American publishing rights or not, I said, I don't want to put it here because I think I'm going to be able to sell this. So I'm not going to post it here for y'all to read. And the guy goes, oh, so in other words, I was right. And I was like, okay, man, whatever, you're right. And he got to be right, and I got a 6-book contract.
And you turned the caps lock key off and went to writing your book.
Right, and I was busy working on my book from that point,
Right.
And it wasn't long after that I got an agent, and then the Dresden files sold, and it wasn't too long after that I managed to get the codex sold. And it was at the point that I did that I realized, oh, I can actually feed my family. I've become a professional now.
And that had to be an amazing feeling.
But it was pretty cool. I mean, it was neat because I was used to being the auxiliary income. I mean, I was working full time, but my ex had her degree in engineering, and so she had a serious job. Engineers get paid the real money, and meanwhile I was working overnight at a local internet provider, being their 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. guy and keeping everything running overnight.
Doing phone support or just
phone
servers
support
up?
and dealing with all the customers on the phone and getting a lot of writing done, actually, because after about 2:30 in the morning you really don't get nearly as many calls.
Right. When you first put out when you started writing Codex, so this is obviously a very different world from Dresden, and this is a complete fantasy world compared to Dresden, which is set in Chicago, and of course there are fantastical elements, but it's still real modern day Chicago. What is the world building? How is the world building different in those two scenarios for you? Is one easier than the other?
Oh, it's much easier.
Which one is easier?
Chicago's easier.
Okay.
Because I can go there and I've got this enormous, this enormous mountain of reference material basically that I can use, that I don't have to come up with anything. Because this building is there, that building is there. Here's what it looks like. Here's this intersection of these streets, going right over the Chicago River. etc. All these things that I can find, anything I want to find in Chicago, I can get on the net, I can get online, I can talk to people who live there and find it, and I've got something to work with. When you're writing fantasy, you've got to build all of that yourself and then start writing your story. So, you've got to construct this completely imaginary landscape, and you've got to do it well enough to make the reader believe it, and then you get to start telling your story after that. And fantasy, it's so much harder to keep the characters as involved and as nuanced and as sharply defined when you also have to be, spending effort on building the world behind them and making that believable to the reader.
How are the magic systems different in Alera and in the Dresden universe?
Oh, the Dresden magic system is the Alera system is very focused. It's very specific. It deals, specifically with dealing with furies and with the limits and boundaries of dealing with these furies and using them for your advantage. It's a native magic system. It's a fairly small one, a fairly limited one, and a fairly exclusive one. In the Dresden Files, the magic system is a much broader, much more nebulous system that is much more inclusive than it is exclusive. So there's lots of things that are using magic, and based upon how they approach it and kind of the mental construct that they have in mind as they utilize it, they get very, very different results. So, the wizard's view of magic that mortal wizards have is a completely valid view from where they're standing, but it's not the only viewpoint on how magic works in the Dresden Files world. So these other people utilize it, and other beings will utilize it in different ways because they don't come at it from the same mindset as that wizards do. And so it's a much more mutable thing in the Dresden Files world. I mean, it's more a source of energy that can be drawn on in any number of different ways. Whereas in Alera, when you're working with the Furies, it's very much kind of a much more structured, formal thing. It's a much more like a much more traditional Japanese martial art as opposed to MMA fighting, which blends many, many things together and is very inclusive from many different martial arts.
Gotcha. When you are just having time where you just sitting and just dreaming about writing, which world is more native to you? If an idea pops into your head, does it tend to be in Harry's world, or is it do you still get Alera story ideas, or with your new series, The Cinder Spires? But which one of those worlds are you more comfortable in?
Oh, it's very rarely really worlds that I'm comfortable in. It's characters I'm comfortable writing from, whose perspective I'm comfortable writing from. I'm always comfortable writing from Dresden's perspective, but eventually I get sick of the guy after I've been working with him for like 6 months at a time. I just want to beat him up. So I'm always very glad to go to a book where I've got multiple viewpoint characters, multiple perspectives to come at. This was one of the things I really enjoyed about the new book, is I've got so many different viewpoint characters to go with. So there are some characters I'm very, very comfortable with. There's some characters who feel they're very, very different than me, and they feel very different than me. Really, I kind of tend to identify more with, I attach things more to a given character than I do to a story world.
You made a great point when you said sometimes you just get tired of Harry when you've worked on him for 6 months straight. How do you keep a story that's as big and that has lasted as long and still has so far to go? How do you keep that fresh, and how do you keep from just getting disgusted with it?
I kind of know where it's going. I know it's going to have an end. I know what the end is, and I'm working towards it. If I had a story that was just going to be open-ended, I would have burned out on it by now. If the Dresden Files was something that I just meant to keep going and going and going, I would have gotten so tired of writing it at this point, and I would not be doing it. But I kind of know where we're going, and I'm trying to set people up for it. It's a very big project, and I need to finish it. That's a drive for me. So while it is sometimes, there are times when it can be a little bit frustrating, where it's difficult to work through a given section of a story. I've got work to do. I've got a job to do. I've got to go finish the story and get to the end.
Yeah. Does having a second series that you're working on help that okay, when I get through this Dresden book, I now have another Cinder Spires book that I get to go
Yeah.
work on. Does that help?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, it does. It very much does. I get sick of Dresden and his problems in his world at times. And it's very, very nice to go and do other things and come up with these very different ideas and to write these very different scenes that I wouldn't get to do anywhere in the Dresden Files.
Yeah. So Alera lasted for 6 books, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Is that story arc done?
Yeah. I mean, that was the story I wanted to tell.
Okay.
I mean, it was a coming of age story, all centered around Tavi and him becoming the First Lord and what he needed to do to fulfill his obligations and be who he needed to be. But I could go back. I mean, there's several different spots I could go back to in Alera if I wanted to go back and do some more stuff there, and that might be fun to do at some point. But I've got enough stories in mind that I want to get written that I'm going to have to live to be like 128 to write them all at my current rate of production. So, I'm not necessarily I don't necessarily have any plans to go back there right now, but I could do it in the future at some point.
I just started listening to the audiobook of the first Cinder Spires book, The Aeronauts Windlass, and you had me hooked at that opening chapter. I guess it's a prologue. I have the book also, but I've just started listening to the audio, and it's going to be fantastic from what I've gotten into so far. But that's a major shift for you from, especially from Dresden. Can you tell us a little bit about where this story idea came from for this steampunk-ish kind of story?
Well, I was deciding what story I was going to work on next, and so to do that, I wrote about the first 20 or 25% of 4 different novels, and I showed them to my beta readers, and just sort of to gauge their reactions and to see which ones they responded most strongly to. And by far, the story they responded most strongly to was this first book of the Cinder Spires. So I said, okay, that'll be what I work on. Where the idea came from. I sat down and I was trying to think of some different projects to do, and I wrote, steampunk novel, and because why not write a steampunk novel? And then I thought, and as I was putting that together, the first thing I had to think was, all right, if I'm going to write a steampunk novel, they're going to have goggles for a reason. There's got to be like a serious reason they're going to have goggles. There's not going to have goggles to be goggles. So I started figuring out, why do you need goggles in this world? And that was a thought exercise, and it got completely out of hand. And by the time I was done with it, I had this entire story world and universe laid out. And I knew all these different things that were happening and exactly how, history had transpired to get the events to where they were right there. And I sort of looked up, 3 or 4 days later, as I first said, well, why do they wear goggles? And then I started scribbling, and I had the story world. So it's like, okay, well, that's probably a pretty good sign that's a strong story. If my brain engaged on it that hard, that seems to be like a really good sign. So I started using that.
Tell us a little bit about the world. What's the setup for the book?
Well, they live in a world where the surface of the planet is extremely dangerous. So human civilization exists almost entirely within these enormous black stone spires called the Cinder Spire. So hence the title of the Cinder Spires. The spires are enormous. They're about 2 miles across, about 2 miles high. With multiple levels that each basically contain their own city, and they're all stacked up on top of one another. But because they stay alive through hydroponics, and they grow meat in vats inside. And the only way that you can communicate and do trade and do diplomacy with other spires is via airship. And so the entire civilization is connected by airships that can sail from one spire to the other. And as we join this story, 2 of the more powerful spires with 2 of the more powerful navies are getting ready to go to war with one another. And the mostly retired monarch of one of the spires has decided that he needs an action team to sort of help position his spire a little bit more advantageously before the war starts. And so he gathers together this group of people that he wants to work for him. So he gets more or less, he gets a pirate. He's not a pirate. He's a privateer. He has a letter of marque, so not a pure pirate. But right. He gets a pirate and a princess and a wizard and a girl who can talk to cats and a warrior. and I mean, we assembled a crew that is very much a standard space opera fantasy crew. I actually wanted to call this a steam opera, but my editor was like, you can't just make up new genres.
I love steam opera, though. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of a steam opera, is what it is. So it's this ensemble cast, and we've got airship battles and duels and tension fraught sittings down to tea where murder might be happening before the end of it, and so on. They set out to find a traitor within their own spire that might have betrayed them to the enemy, and to foil the enemy's plot while the enemy is pursuing goals of their own. And basically, we're getting the opening stages of this conflict, and we'll explore it more in later books. But it's an adventure, and there's airships, and there's warrior monks, and tea and goggles and talking cats, and generally I had a very, very good time writing this book, and so far the readers seem to have had a pretty good time reading it.
Well, yeah, and it opened, I guess, fairly well, like number 5 on the New York Times.
Yeah, it opened at number 5 on the New York Times and number 7 on the USA list. So that's not too shabby. That's pretty good.
That's not too shabby. Yeah, I think you could be proud of that. This is also your longest book to date, isn't it?
Oh yes, it's huge. It's over 200,000 words, and a danger to children and small animals if you drop it. So be careful.
Was the writing process different for this book than the others? It's longer, obviously. Was that on purpose? Did you think that it was going to be a long book from the get-go?
No, I just wound up with more viewpoint characters than I'd originally anticipated, and as a result, there was more story to be told, and that means more words. So it was a longer book.
Nice. Jim, we've been talking for an hour, and I really appreciate your time. What are you working on now? You've got a Dresden book to turn in soon, don't you?
I do. I'm working on Peace Talks, the next book of the Dresden Files, and that's going to be the various supernatural factions are getting together to try and solve this problem that they've had with the Fomor, which has thrown the supernatural world into chaos. So they're getting together in a peace conference to hash things out, and I'm sure that they'll have a nice sit down and work everything out, and then maybe have a nice dinner and sing some songs, and everything will go smoothly.
Of course it will.
Yeah.
Of course it will.
Well, I like to throw curveballs, things you aren't expecting.
Right. After that book, are you working on the next Cinder Spires again? Are you going to kind of rotate those back and forth?
Yes, it'll be ideally I'll be turning out a book every 6 months or so, one Dresden Files, one Cinder Spires.
Wow. Before we go, someone as prolific as you are, how do you maintain a schedule like that? What advice would you give to other writers who say they just can't find the time or just can't stay engaged that long? What advice would you share with other writers for doing that?
Well, the writing process is different for everybody in the first place. So I don't want to say that my way is the only way, but get into a rhythm. Have a regular beat where you sit down and it's time to work. Do what you need to do to be prepared to write and settle down to write. Even if it's only, even if you can only manage to fit in, half an hour a day, make sure that you sit down on a regular basis and that's your writing time, and that your brain knows, this is when it's time for us to be creative. Once you fall into it, if you keep it up, it's like it's like working any other group of muscles. When you start off, don't kill yourself at first. Sit down and see if you can do 250 words. And then after you've been doing 250 words a day steadily for a while, build up to 500, and then 750 and 1,000, and take it a little bit at a time. You got to work yourself into it. It's not like you can just sit down and go 50,000 words, and then stop for a break and come back later and do another 50,000. That's something you got to work up to.
And one day, if you stay with it long enough, you can get 5,000 words a day like you do.
Oh, I don't do that much. But I'm very pleased if I generally set myself a limit and try and hit that many words. But if I come off on over the long term, having done 2,500 words a day, that's pretty good.
Yeah, and you will do an amazing amount of work just being consistent at that.
Yeah, exactly.
For sure.
It adds up. It adds up fast.
Yeah, it sure does. Jim, where can people follow you to stay updated on your work and all that good stuff?
Go to my website at jim-butcher.com. You can follow me on Twitter. You can look for Jim Butcher, and it'll turn up the search. My handle is Longshot Author on Twitter. You can also find me on Facebook.
Great. Jim, thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to chat with us about writing. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you very much.